Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening, wherever you are in the world, and I hope you're doing exceedingly well and that you're having a really lovely week. And before we get settled down and cosy to listen to a lovely story with a lovely hot cup of cocoa or, coffee, whatever you drink, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. I think tonight's story is a real eye-opener for many of us because certainly it was for Matt. His story he was reluctant in coming forward with because, he knows that this is a controversial subject when it comes to marriage, and certainly in his life he really struggled to be happy because he had a very difficult marriage to his wife Myrtle. And it was an enchantment encounter with a Bigfoot. When he saw this Bigfoot, and he had an encounter that really spoke to him in more ways than you can imagine. And that was when his life really took a miraculous turning. So let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, my name is Matt and I'm from Seattle. And my Bigfoot encounter happened to me in a very spontaneous road trip in my brother's RV that happened to me in 1989. I'd been married to my long-time wife, Myrtle, for over 10 long years, and we lived in a very lovely, cosy cottage-style home in Seattle, Washington, with its beautiful landscaped gardens and exquisite lakefront views. We lived in a very upmarket area of Washington. You would think that having such an idyllic lifestyle, living in the lap of luxury, surrounded by modern-day creature comforts, would bring me great pleasure, but it most certainly did not. Because I was so miserable and desperately unhappy in my solitary, lonely little world. I was the one that arrived at work an hour earlier than the office regulars, and I was the one that would leave work so late that the cleaners had arrived in the office for their night shift duties. They would glance at me piteously as I gathered my belongings and my briefcase together to make my way back home. In truth, I had such an empty, meaningless and lonely life, of which there appeared to be no hope in the horizon, and no opportunity for a brighter tomorrow. Every day was quite literally a colourless photocopy of the previous murky, dull grey day. It was a monotonous repetition of endless drudgery, of the incessant routine of daily life. My home life was so miserable that I focused all my attention in the workplace, and I worked as a banker, so my fastidious attention to detail was recognised by my superiors, and I was being continuously promoted and earning a very successful six-figure salary. I drove a 1989 Bentley Turbo R, and wherever I went I would observe the envious glances of regulars in downtown Seattle as they observed me driving my very opulent-looking car. I would often think to myself, if only you knew that you have nothing to envy. On the contrary, you probably have a much better life than I do. It would not have taken much to be marginally happier than I was, I can assure you. People always falsely believe that if you have money, you have everything. But I assure you that that is not the case. You can be rich and miserable, and happy and poor. It is, of course, infinitely more preferable to be rich and miserable than poor and miserable, because let's not kid, whatever way you look at it, the world isn't very kind to you when you have no money. How do I know this? Well, I came from a very impoverished background myself, and growing up I falsely believed society's message that money would just transform my life. So I knew that when I left home, I was going to make it big. That's exactly what I did, and that's what I pursued. I was one child among 2 brothers and 3 sisters, and we grew up in a run-down, poverty-stricken area of New York. It was a tough life growing up, because we didn't always have enough food in the home, and that is difficult. There were days when we lived on toast and baked beans or spaghetti and tomato sauce. We grew up in a single-parent home, as my father absconded a very long time ago, and to this day I have no memory or recollection of him. I do know that he died about 10 years ago, but it did not have an emotional impact on any of us, because he had pretty much deserted and abandoned all of us, so we didn't really have much empathy about his passing, as insensitive as that may sound. In truth, things would have been very different if we'd actually known him. I gather he was actually quite a charming man. Even though our family was poor, we didn't lack love in our home. And despite the financial challenges we faced on a daily basis, we were incredibly close, loving and a happy family, with many beautiful memories that no money in the world can buy. When I was 20, I got married to my childhood sweetheart Myrtle, and I really believed that she was the love of my life. But 2 years into our marriage, she quite literally turned into a vindictive bully. In her eyes, I was never good enough, and I was such a huge disappointment to her. There was nothing that I could do that was right in her eyes. I would literally come back home and sit down on the couch, and if I dared to relax, she would call me lazy and useless. We never relaxed or chatted together, but instead it was like there was a huge gulf that grew wider and wider every single day between us. We would both sit on the couch, eating a microwave dinner as Myrtle never cooked, and we would not be saying a word to each other the whole time, almost as if we were strangers in an office canteen. I kid you not, that was how emotionally disconnected and detached we were from each other. If I wanted to change the television channel to watch something else, there would be pandemonium in our home, as Myrtle would become irate and complain bitterly. "Why do you want to destroy my viewing?" she would shout, as if she was the only one that deserved consideration in our relationship. It was like the only person that deserved happiness was Myrtle, and nobody else mattered. Before long, it was easier to let her pretty much do whatever she wanted to keep the peace, and to indulge her with her long lists of jobs she required me to do around the home, and those lists were mile long. I was not exactly proficient at DIY, so I would end up being humiliated by my wife for my poor inferior workmanship. I withdrew into my shell, much like a tortoise, as a form of self-preservation, I think, and I became introverted, quiet and subdued, and she tirelessly nagged and nagged and nagged. I can truly say that I became lonely in my marriage, and my greatest, most powerful distraction was, in fact, work. I used every excuse in the book to avoid coming home at night, as much as I possibly could, because it felt like I was literally returning home to the enemy. We had everything we could financially ever need or desire, because my huge salary made that possible. But no matter how much money I was making, it was never enough for Myrtle, who was always quick to point out that someone else was making a whole lot more money than I was. That is a huge trap that people do get into when they become rich. Sometimes they develop this desirous need to hold on to more money than they will ever acquire in their lives. As you can imagine, there was a dreadful emptiness in my life that was beyond anything I could describe. My wife's persistent undermining and belittling of me was like a dripping tap, and it was the beginning to get to that place where I could stand it no longer. No wonder they used dripping taps as a form of torture in wartime situations when dealing with an adversary, because believe me, living with a nagging spouse or a dripping tap is absolutely no different. You are quite literally living with the enemy. My wife would say things to me like, "You're a waste of space. I do not know what I ever saw in you when I got married. I could have married someone so much wealthier than you." Her words would sting like salt on an open wound. You can imagine how devastating it is to live around such negativity. You truly are better off living on your own in such a situation. I truly do not want to engender pity from any of your listeners, believe me, as I paint my story into words. I just want to tell you exactly how it was. To the outside world and at social events, Myrtle and I looked as if we had the perfect married life and the most enviable marriage. And that's what Myrtle wanted people to believe. In public, Myrtle acted like the devoted, loving and adoring wife, but the moment we were back in the Bentley on our drive back home, she would be yelling and complaining about what I'd failed to say to her friends. Everything in my life was just a plastic facade. It was all about appearances and nothing about reality. I began to have a longing and yearning in my heart to escape it all and to leave Myrtle, but I never had the courage to actually break free from my trapped life. I guess the idea of leaving Myrtle and getting divorced was something that I would never have anticipated happening to me. I was the committed type that would stick at anything, come hell or high water, and divorce to me meant I'd failed in some way to make things work, and that simply was not a viable option for me. One day as I left the office, late to return home, and drove towards our magnificent Washington house, I parked my Bentley outside our gate and looked in. I could see through the large French windows and that the lights were on. In that moment I could taste the nausea rising up in my throat, and an overwhelming feeling of familiar dread overcame me, and I just knew in that second that I could not go back into that house. In fact, I never wanted to go back into that house ever again, if I could possibly help it. I found myself driving to my brother Stephen's house, and he lived in Washington, but in a much less ostentatious area than I did. He was very happily married to his lovely wife Hilda, and they lived in a very basic, rather rudimentary, rather simple home, but had a very satisfying life together, and they adored each other. They did have a few financial problems, like many married couples invariably do, but they had been trying to sell their RV for a long while to raise some much-needed extra cash. Quite suddenly I had a brainwave. I perceived what my next plan of action would be, which was a win-win situation for both of us. I wanted them to sell me their RV, and they could do with the money, and I could do with an adventure some time and space away from my nagging wife. In short, I boldly revealed the secret that I had not divulged to a solitary soul until that moment. I explained to my horrified brother and his equally shocked wife Hilda that my marriage to Myrtle was indeed a huge sham, and that I had not been happily married to her for a very long time, and I had decided on a whim that I just wanted out. I needed to buy your RV right now, I told him. I'm leaving now. Are you sure you're doing the right thing, my brother said. Is this not all a little impulsive of you? Have you even told Myrtle about all this? And what about this road trip of yours? And what about your job? Do you not have to give them notice before you just disappear into the sunset like this? Isn't this a little bit hasty of you? The job's not a problem, I said. I've not taken a holiday for over 5 years now, and the bank hasn't been happy about that, so they'll be thrilled if I take some time off. As for Myrtle, I'd like you to phone her, I said to my brother. Tell her that I've gone away and that I've some serious thinking to do about the state of affairs between us. Is it not better that you speak to her yourself, said my brother. You don't know the real Myrtle, I said, like I do. She'll be bullying me to stay, and I'm so pathetically obedient, like a whipped dog, I'll go scurrying back. I know I will. I really need some space, and this is my opportunity to have some guts and do what I should have done a very long time ago. I had no idea you had such a miserable marriage, said Hilda, looking aghast. I'm just so shocked. I don't actually know what to say. You look like the happiest couple. I know you have a lot of money. Surely that's got to count for something. Surely most people would only dream of being as well off as you. Money, Hilda. That's what everybody thinks. You get rich and everything's suddenly hunky-dory. But I assure you it isn't like that. Life doesn't work like that. All my life I believed the false lie that money was the answer. Oh, it helps. Let's kid you not. And it does make life incredibly more comfortable, and there's a lot less to worry about on the financial side of things. All that's incredibly true. But you know what really matters at the end of the day? It's love and relationships. That's what really counts. That is what is truly sustaining and long-lasting. And I've been so lonely in my life with Myrtle for about 8 years now. No money in the world can buy back all that wasted time. I'd give anything to have what you and Stephen have, and you cannot buy that with any money. Wow! Things have been so tough for you, said Hilda, her eyes filling with tears. I've no idea that things were this bad. I so wish you'd confided in us. You could go to marriage counselling, Stephen suggested. They can work miracles these days. You could even see our pastor at the local church. He's really good. He could give you some sound advice on how to rekindle the flame. Are you going to sell me your RV or not? I asked, bringing out my chequebook and scribbling out a generous cheque for my brother. I really didn't need Stephen to go on about counselling. I'd been down that route before, and Myrtle was absolutely sure that I was responsible for her happiness. And one thing I've learnt in life is that we are responsible for our own happiness. My brother looked at the cheque and gasped. "That's way too much," he said. "The REV is not even worth that much. This is too generous. I cannot accept it." "It's only money," I said, "and if it can make a difference, then that's a good thing." "What about clothes?" asked my brother. "I can throw some of my stuff your way, because you might need something to wear. You're still in your suit, and you're going to need some rough clothes on your trip." "Come inside," urged Hilda. "Have a shower, a change of clothes, and a nice homemade meal inside you, and then you can be well on your way." "Where are you going to go?" asked my brother curiously over dinner. "I'm going to Vancouver," I said. "I fancy spending some time in the Canadian wilderness." "Haven't you got to have a passport for that?" "Aren't you going to need one?" "As it so happens, I keep my passport with me," I said. "But I am going to need to leave my Bentley with you if you don't mind, but you're welcome to use it." "Wow, people really will think we've gone up in the world," laughed Hilda. So there I was, out in my new second-hand RV, on the open road, on a wild, spontaneous, impulsive adventure, and I truly felt like a caged bird that had finally been given a brand new pair of wings and was set free. It was quite simply the most liberating feeling that I've ever felt in my life. I was driving the 1980 Jamboree Class C camper, which had plenty of sleeping space inside for me, a lovely kitchenette area and a small shower. It would be perfect for all my immediate needs. It was dark when I left my brother's house, and I was so excited. I could feel the butterflies in my stomach because I knew that this trip was going to be an adventure of a lifetime, and I could hardly wait. I took the I-5 north to Canada, and although it was dark, it felt beautiful driving in these wide open spaces, and I drove past the snow-capped peak of Mount Baker, and when it's light you can usually see the breathtaking views over the Cascade Mountains in the distance. Finally I drove through the Canadian border with relatively ease and hardly any hold-ups, until I finally was in Canada. Fast forward 1.5 weeks. I'd been driving through the Canadian wilderness, visiting so many magnificent, intriguing and exciting places, and meeting so many wonderful and interesting people. For the first time in my life, I began to feel vibrant and alive again, more like the old person I had long since lost touch with. I had not even given Myrtle a second thought, and I could not decide whether that was a good thing or not. I just knew it was wonderful to be out of the viper's nest, and to be footloose and fancy-free, as selfish as that may sound. All I needed to concern myself with every day was where I was going to spend the next night in my RV, and what places to visit and explore each day. It was on a chance encounter at a local bookshop in Vancouver, when I was buying a map of the area, that a delightful elderly customer, who was clearly a local, asked me if I was new to Canada. When I told her all about my RV adventure and all the exciting places that I had actually visited, she graciously gave me the name of a remote, very scenic location that was in the middle of nowhere. "You simply must go there. It's quite literally the most magnificent, gorgeous place," she said, "and it's teeming with wildlife, and it's got wonderful, vast areas of woods to explore. You'll just love it there. It's so solitary and so peaceful." When she gave me all the details, I checked the map, and the area she mentioned was so remote it was not even properly marked on the map. But I did have a fair idea where I could find it from what the kind lady had actually told me. I found myself driving down a very bumpy dirt road with high rocky elevations on both sides, and further back you could just see the never-ending expanse of the towering aspen, cottonwood, black spruce and pine trees that literally went back for many miles. Finally the road came into a fork, and I took the right turning until I came to an iron gate with the name Black Spruce on it. I opened the gate and drove down the long rocky road that twisted and turned until finally I came to a clearing with a sign that read, "RV campers and hikers welcome," but I could see I was the only one there. Naturally, that didn't bother me or concern me at all. On the contrary, I was very happy to feel so isolated and cut off from the material world. The jewels of nature and her ravishing bounty far surpassed anything that she could offer, that was for certain. I parked the RV in a very spectacular spot under a large aspen tree that overlooked the shimmering silver lake lake that reflected on its surface the superb mountainous valleys and the towering majestic aspen trees. It didn't get better than this. I felt as if I'd quite literally died and gone to heaven. It was just so magnificent. That night I made a fire pit outside my RV and grilled some delicious and juicy burgers for myself, and I sat back to enjoy the magnificent sunset over the water that painted the blue-grey firmament in golden and tangerine hues, and then it all but faded to be replaced by the dusty, starry-filled night. I decided I would turn in early, and that's exactly what I did. It must have been about 12:10 at night when I sensed something was rattling my RV, as it wobbled under a vibration. My first impression was that there had been a mild earthquake, but then I realised that something or someone appeared to be shaking my vehicle and wobbling it intentionally, and whoever was doing this had to be very strong. Imagine my surprise when I pulled back the curtains to see this huge face staring back at me. It was too dark to get an impression of the face, but the eyes had a very distinctive red eyeshine, and the face seemed dark and hairy. But nothing felt menacing. But in that moment I was half asleep, so I went back to bed, convincing myself that I was just dreaming. Even when I awoke the following morning, I meditated on my strange, very vivid dream that had felt so very real. I'm not a stranger to very lucid dreaming, and so I was emphatically believing that the rocking of my RV and the odd face at the window was just one of those things, a crazy lucid dream. That morning I decided that I would take a hike into the beautiful wooded area, and so I put on some hiking boots and prepared a slight picnic lunch, and armed with some bear spray and an air horn, I ventured into the woods. There are no words in the English language capable of describing the resplendence, magnificence of these woods. The tall, majestic trees, with their powerful, strong, barky girths, sometimes layered in carpets of pretty green moss, literally towered in the blue-grey firmament like statuesque emerald giants, and the scant spaces between the trees allowed enough shafts of sunlight to dance through the canopy and envelop the pretty fern-covered forest floor in a soft yellow light. The mellow, gentle ambience was made perfect by the cacophony of pretty bird songs, from pretty warbles to peeps, tweets, and chirping. It was a delightful, audible, sensory and visual experience. Suddenly the bird song retreated and just vanished and became airily quiet. Then I heard a growling sound, and I could hear something tearing through the bush. It sounded like two hefty creatures, and I was right. They came bolting past me, so intent on lashing out at each other that they barely noticed me standing there. In fact, they didn't notice me at all. Let me tell you that is very bizarre, because I have encountered bears in the past before, and they have a phenomenal sense of smell. These creatures had bounded past me, were actually two very large brown grizzly bears, and should have immediately reacted to my presence, but they didn't, not to mention my human-like smell. But I believe their sense of smell had been hijacked by the desire to acquire dominance over the other in order to win the female suitor and establish mating rights. I think this drive was so powerful that quite literally everything in their surroundings, not to mention their immediate environment, lacked any significance or relevance at this poignant moment in time. I did not know how to react, and I quickly just took cover behind a very large tree trunk, watching the scene unfold before me in horrified dismay, with my bear spray propped up in my hand in case I should need to have to use it. I did not want to draw attention to myself by walking away, so I just stood very still, believing this to be the best course of action at this immediate moment. These grizzlies were quite literally tearing each other apart. I know of no other way to describe it, and I knew that one of them would end up very seriously injured or even fatally wounded after the attack. One of the bears had an open, bloody gash on the side of his leg and a really nasty, jagged laceration, possibly caused by a bite, and I could see it was bleeding very, very badly. With all my heart, I wished that I could intervene and stop that terrible fight and encourage them to go their separate ways and not to harm each other so willfully like this. In that moment I realised how brutal and cruel nature can be, and it truly is about the survival of the fittest. so that the strongest gene pool flourishes. It is not vindictive, nor is it nasty. It is what it is. That is just nature for you. The survival of the fittest, I think that's what it's called. Suddenly I heard the most hideous scream that I've ever heard, and it truly sounded like a woman being murdered, causing my whole body to shake violently and to tremble in terror. It was quite possibly the most petrifying sound that I have ever heard in my entire life. What amazed me more was that the two grizzlies remained oblivious to that startling sound. They were so intent on killing each other and so focused on their fight that they seemed to block everything out, seemingly oblivious of anything happening around them. Then I heard a sound unlike anything I've ever heard before and hope to ever hear again. Something that sounded like a rhino coming thundering and bolting through the woods. And whatever this thing was, it was clearly on 2 feet, and it was colossal. Then I saw her, and nothing prepared me for what I was about to see. She was definitely female, and easily over 9 foot tall and 800 pounds and 4 foot wide. She was covered from head to toe in soft, magnificent strawberry blonde hair that blew back in the winds. I knew she was female, not only because of her pert hair-covered breasts, but she possessed a very strong feminine energy that was undeniable. One thing that blew me away about her was the size of her gargantuan shoulders that were quite literally massive, and she was literally ripped with muscle from head to toe. She was formidable, majestic, powerful, lofty, and utterly magnificent. And I have no idea what kind of animal she actually was, but she looked like she was an amalgamation of an ape and a wild woman. She did possess the long arms so typical of the ape-like species, but despite their length they were more human-like and muscular. Her hands and feet were also human-like and monstrously big in their proportions. Her head was cone-shaped, and her face was long and angular and human-like, with big hazel-brown intelligent eyes, a large flat nose and a slender mouth. I should have been terrified by this creature, but I was so shocked by what I was actually seeing. I did not know how to react to her. She commanded such respect that I was in awe of her. The hairy humanoid was not at all happy with these grizzly bears, fighting in the way that they actually were, and she seemed undaunted and unfazed about dealing with 2 massive, bad-tempered grizzlies. She literally pulled them apart with effortless ease, using her monstrous big arms to separate the 2 of them, and she released the most terrifying, frightening growl that was so intimidating that it caused my body to literally tremble and shake. When the grizzlies saw the humanoid, they almost cowered in horror. I've never seen grizzlies bolt off in the way that they both did, but they were clearly frightened of the ape. Maybe they had experienced with her before, I do not know, but I do know this: I have never seen grizzlies so frightened before. They usually aren't frightened of anything, but they were petrified of her. She managed to get them off to run in different directions, which was deliberate on her part, and I sensed she wanted to separate them and end the barbaric fight. I really believe that she hated fighting, and that's why she wanted to put a stop to it. I watched her squatting on the floor of the forest, basking in the soft shafts of sunlight, and she seemed to be enjoying her little moment of peace. She clearly loved the serenity of the forest and hated any conflict and discord. I could hear her whistling happily to herself, and then she raised herself off the ground with extreme agility, and I watched her glide out of the forest with a seamless grace and fluidity unlike anything that I've ever seen before. She really was quite magnificent in her pose, grace, strength, and splendour. I remember walking back to the RV, and it suddenly occurred to me the dream that I'd had the previous night. I wondered whether the strawberry blonde-haired ape was the creature that had been rocking my RV and peering at me through the window. Maybe it wasn't a lucid dream after all. Maybe it had actually been real. So I decided to investigate things when I got back to my RV, and believe it or not, I found a large humanoid footprint outside the RV window in the soft, moist sand, and that was where I'd seen the face peering at me. It measured 22 inches in size, and I'm almost certain that the footprint belonged to her. I think she must have been curious about me or something, but I do not believe she had any intention of harming me. She didn't have that energy about her. I stayed at the camping ground a couple more days and did some hiking, and although I never saw the hairy humanoid again, I sensed her presence and energy, and I believe she watched me and even followed me a little on my hike. I believe she was interested and curious about me. I think she was a very peace-loving, gentle but very intelligent creature. After watching the hairy humanoid ape, that I now know, all these years later, to be a Bigfoot, break up the fight between those two grizzlies, I had an epiphany. I realised that those two grizzlies represented Myrtle and myself, and we were quite literally tearing each other apart, so that we were bleeding and oozing from our wounds. The Bigfoot had made those two bears go their separate ways, so that they didn't end up killing each other, and suddenly everything made sense to me, and I knew what needed to be done. When I got back to Washington, I got a divorce from Myrtle, and to date I have never ever looked back, nor have I ever regretted those choices. I believe that Bigfoot showed me when it is not working, it just is not going to ever be fixed. Now, believe me, I'm not advocating divorce by any manner of means to any of your listeners, because I believe that some marriages can be saved, but mine was not salvageable. Myrtle and I were like those two grizzlies that needed to be separated before we ended up destroying each other or even killing each other. These days I have a spring to my step and cannot wait to get home to my beautiful wife, who I've been married now to for 20 long years, and I've never been happier. I feel privileged to have met a female Bigfoot in those woods, and I will never forget her because she helped me power steer my life in a whole new direction, although I doubt she's even aware how she impacted my life in that way. She made me realise the importance of living a peaceful, serene life. I gather Myrtle got married 3 more times to very wealthy men, but now she lives on her own and is rich and miserable. So money does not buy everything, and you are responsible for your own happiness. I'm writing this during the COVID-19 epidemic, so there may be people out there who've lost their jobs and are struggling financially. There may be people having rough times in their marriages, and my heart goes out to each and every one of them. My biggest life lesson in life is to live in peace and savour every day. But if something is sucking and draining the life out of your very soul, you might need to reconsider your options, because nothing is ever worth that. So that is my story. I just want to thank you so very much for your story, and I think you make a very poignant point. I think that we cannot live our lives in misery and unhappiness, and if something is draining us of that, we really do have to reconsider our options, because nothing is worth being miserable about. And I do think with the COVID-19 crisis, there is so much struggle going on out there. People are having challenges they've never had to face before, so life is difficult. But what you've made so clear to us is that nothing is more important than the people we love and the relationships that we hold dear. I do hope that you enjoyed his story, because I certainly did. Until next time, goodbye and good night.